Hey everyone, hope you're all doing well today. I'm recording this really early morning, so it should be nice and peaceful today. Welcome to part two of my Dateline documentary summary. If you haven't seen part one, I think you should probably go and watch that before watching this, otherwise, you might not know what I'm talking about in some parts of this video. Also, if you haven't seen the full documentary, please make sure that you do go and watch that, and I'll post a link to CJ's Twitch channel where you can see either of the watch parties. And like I've said before, I recommend watching both. So I really did want this to be two parts instead of three, but there was just too much information to get into two videos. And as you know, the Dateline documentary is actually very long already. So I figured you guys wouldn't appreciate me making you watch like super long summaries of a already super long documentary. So I hope that this is okay. What I'm going to do for this video is I'm just going to pick off where I left off from the last video, and I'm just going to cover the timeline of events from the night of the actual crime as presented by Dateline. And I might cover a little bit of the next day, but then I'm going to stop and make sure that the conclusion of the documentary is its own video in part three. And I think that that's better because this video covers some pretty graphic details, and it's a very serious topic. I think it should be its own video. And yeah, without wasting any more time, let me get straight into it. I stopped in the last video just before the 12th of November. So on the 12th of November, Dateline tells us that it was a big game day in Moscow. And they show us this famous final photo of the roommates that was taken on that day, actually. And while I have it up here, a lot of people have been bringing up this piece of hair next to Dylan lately. It has always been like that, though. So, I mean, I gave up a long time ago trying to understand what was going on there, honestly, but let me know what you think. I really don't know. After they show us this picture, they introduce the roommates as well as Ethan. So they start with Maddie, which I mean is hardly surprising. If you watched the last video, you know what I think about that. They are constantly trying to frame Maddie as some kind of a central figure in this whole story. They have a very clear agenda. Their narrative is very much that they're trying to push that Maddie was very beautiful and that Brian Koberger had a lot of resentment about the fact that he couldn't be with somebody like her. And another thing that they really want to assert is that Brian Koberger couldn't get women. So that is, pretty much crucial to their message. After they introduce Maddie, they show us Kaylee, and they mention that she had moved out but was briefly visiting, and that she also wanted to show her friends her new car. Then they introduce Sana and they introduce Ethan as her boyfriend, and they say that he was often at the house even though he didn't love them. Then they point out Dylan and Bethany. We know who they are. We've all come to refer to them as the survivors of that night, but Dateline refers to them as two new roommates. Then they remind us that Ashlyn had planned to be there, but had to house sit for her parents last minute. If you watch the first video, you'll know that Ashlyn was like a former resident of the house. Now, that's meant to be everyone, but I have often wondered if there was anybody else there, just because we don't really know who took this photo. And I know that it could have been taken on a photo timer, but for some reason, I just wonder like, it's not a selfie, so was there possibly somebody else there? I'm not sure. After that, they talk to Angela some more, and for those of you who don't remember, that's Ashlyn's mom. She elaborates on Ashlyn needing to house sit last minute and confirms that Ashlyn definitely wasn't there. Now, this thing about Ashlyn almost being there, they make very dramatic. And I don't want to discount anything that she's feeling. I get that it probably is very dramatic and it's like a big deal in her life, but I also like question the relevance of it for this documentary. Um, I also noticed that Ashlyn's mom, Angela, seems a little angry when she talks about how Ashlyn won't go home now. If you've watched it, let me know if you saw that. It's kind of subtle, but you can definitely see it if you know what to look for. It's like a flash of anger when she's talking about that. Anyway, so let's return to the timeline. They note that the game lasted from 4:02 p.m. to 7:12 p.m. And they also tell us that Brian Koberger was on YouTube at 8:08 p.m. So remember from the last video, I noted that they do appear to have some kind of a copy of Brian Koberger's phone, which, I mean, we all know is quite irregular. And then they say that Kaylee posted this final photo at 9 p.m. They say that Ethan and Xana were at a fraternity party, but Dateline does not commit to a time frame for this, which I think is something we've gotten really used to when it comes to Ethan and Xana's timeline. It's actually just very vague. They continue, they talk about Kaylee and Maddie and how they arrived at the corner club sometime after 10 p.m. and how they left at 1:37 a.m. to go to the grub truck. Then they report that one of the two of them contacted a young fraternity member to transport them home. Now that's worded a little differently to what we're used to. We always just hear that it was Eric. I'm not sure if they're trying to say that this was Eric. I guess that is what they're trying to say. I'm not sure. Then they say that Dylan and Bethany arrived home around 2 a.m. And they say that Ethan and Xana would follow shortly. So, more vagueness in terms of Ethan and Xana's timeline. Like I said, we're quite used to that. They also report that Kaylee and Maddie started calling Jack around 2:26 a.m. They don't name Jack though, they just say an ex-boyfriend, but we all know that it's Jack, so I'm just going to say Jack. Like that's not really a secret. Then they claim that Brian Koberger turned off his phone at 2:54 a.m. in Pullman. We also hear about how a white car was detected in the southeast corner of Moscow at 3:26 a.m. And then they continue to show us all of this balcony footage that they shouldn't have. I just want to point that out. Like, they shouldn't have this. And then it's like they realize that we haven't heard from Howard Blum in a while, so they go fetch him. And they fetch him just so that he can explain to us that all of this balcony footage, despite what it looks like, what it actually shows is that Brian Koberger was going through an internal battle and that he had ultimately decided that he wanted to go through with this crime, but there was still a little bit of a back and forth for him at this point, as you can see from this footage. I mean, if you look for it, it's there. Right. Okay, so then they continue to explain that most of the occupants of the house were in their rooms by 4 a.m., except for Xana, who received a food order. They show more balcony footage they shouldn't have, and they say that the car approached the house at 4:07 a.m. Then they get Dr. Mercado back briefly, and I'm going to be honest, I'm not even sure what he was trying to say, but I'm just letting you know that he was there. Then Dateline informs us that the police believe that the car contained a driver and a knife. Now, this is pure theatrics on their part because obviously. Then they bring back Dr. Bricado, who's now ready to share his thoughts with us about how this crime resulted from a culmination of a lifetime of repeated rejection, which prompted the killer to try and enact the fantasy that Dr. Bricado has been telling us about the whole time. And then this is where I may get a bit ranty, guys, but in an abundance of overwhelming professionalism, Dateline decides to show us an animation of the house, and they stress that this shows what may have happened on the night of the crime, as if slightly emphasizing the word may somehow excuses this decision of theirs. And I do have to stop here and say that I think that this animation is extremely irresponsible and extremely misleading. And the reason for that is because it reinforces an order of events that only one side agrees with, and it does it visually, which is very dangerous. So, there's more than enough information available for them to at least try and present both sides' opinion of what happened. So, I kind of feel compelled that before I get into the animation, I'm going to remind you about what they've failed to bring up. And this is just from court records. There is no mention of a defense expert saying that there could have been more than one killer, particularly that they think there might have been two killers. There's nothing about the possibility of more than one weapon, and there's also no comment about the defense's assertion that Brian Koberger is not compatible with this time frame. So that's why I say it's extremely one-sided, and all it's really done is literally visually imprint the state's version of events in the minds of the public before a jury has even been picked. And I don't think that people properly understand how serious that is because everybody's just like focusing on the information that's coming out during the animation. But what about the actual act of putting this out? It's really serious. But look, they do continue to validate their depiction of events by saying that it's based on the memory of former residents, and I'm just going to assume that Ashland Couch is one of them. Then they talk about court records and police affidavits, which worries me so much because I really hope that they're just talking about the PCA, but at this rate, I'm not sure. Then they continue to say it also included real estate records and social media photos, but they're not done. In case you've missed this guy, they also say that they consulted with sources close to the investigation who were so kind as to give Dateline their thoughts on what might have happened that night. Okay, so that was the rant. Now we can get into the timeline. Allegedly, the killer entered the home sometime after 4:07 a.m. through the unlocked kitchen door and went immediately to Maddie's room. This is one of the reasons that they believe Maddie was the target. Now, I know what you're wondering. Are they planning on giving some kind of a forensic basis for this line of travel? No, not in particular. They say the killer was surprised that Kaylee was in Maddie's room, and Dr. Mercado explains that this was very disruptive to the killer's plan, but Dateline continues to explain that the killer proceeded regardless and a noisy struggle ensued. Multiple sources close to the investigation, so they're multiplying now, say that Xana heard a thumping sound from the kitchen while she was on TikTok. So she went upstairs to check. This interrupted the killer, who stopped what he was doing and chased Xana back down the stairs. Dr. Mercado thinks that it was in this chaotic situation that the killer dropped the sheath into Maddie's bed. The same sources think that Xana was trying to get back to Ethan, who was either passed out or asleep, but she was caught as she reached her bedroom. They talk about sounds captured on a nearby camera at 4:17 a.m., and I don't know why I'm surprised, but they even play those because yes, they have them too. They say that Ethan was attacked in bed with a single strike to an artery. Now, we didn't know that. It's very shocking information. It is very upsetting to hear it, but that is something that they are reporting. Dr. Mercado feels that this, in terms of Ethan, supports the theory that the crime was motivated by a hatred for women, because the male victim was, in his words, rapidly dispatched. But then Dateline reveals something pretty shocking. They say that Ethan's lower legs were carved, and they note that that was the word investigators used. They used the word carved. Dr. Mercado still feels that this was probably a gender-based crime because Ethan was an obstacle in the killer's path, so when the killer felt overwhelmed by anger towards the male victim, he decided to, quote, do something extra, thus the leg thing. Now, I have to say that this makes absolutely no sense to me because it's pretty clear to me that one of the motives of the documentary is to assert that Maddie was the target. So if Maddie was the target, then any person disrupting the killer's access to her, regardless of gender, would have been an obstacle, not the male who was passed out in another room. He would have actually been the least in the way. So that kind of disrupts the message that this was about Maddie. And I think that if Dr. Brocado wants to sort of assert this theory, then he should maybe note that he feels it's in relation to a hatred for women in general and not necessarily Maddie, because it's confusing for the viewer. So if he disagrees with the documentary, I feel like he should say so. I don't think that they should pick and choose what suits them. I think that it's a little, it clouds things a little bit. But then Dateline says that the killer sat down in a bedroom chair, leaving an imprint in blood. Another thing that we didn't know, another kind of shocker. Now, I have to point out that a lot of us have been criticizing the state's timeline all along, and we didn't even know that this guy is meant to have taken a break in the middle of all of this. Because, I mean, if he didn't have time, like a lot of us think, to commit the crime in the time that they say, how did he have the time to take a seat? I don't know. They also don't say how they know that it was definitely the killer. Uh, they don't say if it could have been a victim during the struggle, and I guess that's really going to depend on what the imprint looks like. But Cooper, if you remember him from part one, and Dr. Brocado both talk about how the killer would have been exhausted. They detail the killer's interaction with Dylan as he passed her door, apparently wanting to exit the scene at the kitchen. Cooper describes Dylan's whole encounter in the hallway and reminds us that she was left in a frozen shock phase. Now, this is a story we've been hearing about for 2 years, so I don't really need to get into it too much. Then they bring back Blum, and I was missing him, who says that Dylan is very fortunate for being quiet because she could have been harmed as well. They explain how Dylan locked herself away, and Cooper does actually acknowledge that she'd been drinking and that she'd fallen asleep earlier. It's put to Cooper that the killer must have thought that Dylan was about to call 911, and I think that this makes sense because that would have been the normal thing to do in this situation, and Cooper does agree. They show the 4:20 a.m. balcony footage from the assortment of footage they should not have, and they assume that this is the killer fleeing the scene. Then I thought I heard them say the car left in such a hurry it almost hit somebody. Did anybody else hear that? Because I've never heard before that there was an eyewitness to the vehicle, which makes me think I might have misheard. Let me know if you heard that too, but I'm pretty sure I'm mistaken. Cooper says the killer was definitely panicking though. By this point, Dylan had had enough time to defrost, from her frozen shock phase, and was making unanswered calls. They say that she was trying to reach the other roommates. She did not call 911. Dateline says for whatever reason, like she had her reasons. Bethany was also making unanswered calls to the others, and Dateline details the texting between Dylan and Bethany that we've all read about already. And that Dylan went to Bethany's room, briefly spotting Xana on the floor on her way. And we hear about how Dylan thought that Xana was just drunk. We've heard that all before. They say that Brian Koberger's phone turned back on at 4:48 a.m. and that Brian Koberger made 3 calls to his Pennsylvania home starting at 6:17 a.m. One of the calls lasted 36 minutes and another of them lasted 54 minutes. They detail more of Dylan and Bethany's phone activity and claim that Brian Koberger was back in the Moscow area at 9:12 a.m. Now, I'm a little bit confused because I'm pretty sure I've seen that investigators said this was not the case, so I don't know why Dateline would be saying that's what happened. Unless I'm confused, I don't know. Dateline also shows Brian Koberger's 10:31 a.m. selfie. And I mean, as to be expected, they make this selfie into a very big deal, as we've seen the media do the entire time. Cooper thinks that Brian Koberger is celebrating by taking this photo. He also points out that Brian Koberger is in front of a shower and wearing fresh clothes. Well spotted. Then they bring Dr. Bricado back, who wants to take this way further. And I told myself, like, be nice. Be nice, Rosie. He wants to talk about how Brian Koberger had previously written that he looked in the mirror and had seen himself as nothing. So Dr. Bricado thinks, from looking at this photo, that the thumbs up in the photo is representative of how Brian Koberger now sees himself as somebody because it's after the crimes. But it's also really important to note that it's a mirror. So it's a reflection. And it means that Brian Koberger now sees himself as a somebody in the eyes of other people. Remember, because it's a mirror. Now, this is all very philosophical. Let me know what you think. I think it's a nice mirror. I think that there's a lot of space on either side for Brian Koberger to do his hair in the morning, and I really wish that I had a mirror that was this big. Anyway, they say that Brian Koberger's phone then reported to a tower south of Pullman, and they suggest that Brian Koberger could have been disposing of evidence since there's a river in that area, and they get Cooper to confirm that it would have been very difficult to retrieve any evidence that may have been disposed of in this particular area. Then they touch on the lack of 911 call through the morning, and Blum believes that the lack of 911 call was related to what he phrases cognitive dissonance, and that the situation was simply too overwhelming for Dylan and Bethany. Now, this is interesting, but it doesn't make any sense. Again, I might have bought into this idea if there had been just one of them. But as we know, there were 2 people, and they spoke to each other about what was going on around them, and they both neglected to call 911. I have to really say, and I shouldn't have to say it, but being unable to call 911 is not a contagious affliction. If Bethany saw Dylan in a state of frozen cognitive what or whatever, then she should have thought to herself, oh shit, maybe it's on me to call 911 now because Dylan's acting funny. Trauma responses are not uniform and they are not contagious. You do not need to be a psychologist to know that. But I do commend Blum on giving it a good try. As we now know, they called a friend who came over and brought male assistance. Dylan saw Xana on the floor again and started crying. The male who came over told the girls to get out and call 911, which goes without saying is always highly recommended in an emergency situation, just by the way. However, this is a little bit weird to me because I thought that we heard the get out instruction during the actual call, and that does confuse when things were seen and when things did even happen. There's a little bit of a lack of clarity on that, which Dateline isn't really touching on. But I mean, do we expect that they would? But they do get to calling 911 eventually at about 11:56 a.m. Dateline plays the call. We've all heard the call. Some of us know the call off by heart. Blum says the girls were clearly overwhelmed during the call. I personally beg to differ, but Dateline didn't ask me, they asked Plum. Moscow Police Department finds the four deceased students upon arrival, all stabbed, and a source close to the investigation says that Xana was in a massive pool of blood. So they do not touch on how Dylan and Bethany could have so severely misunderstood Xana's condition when they saw her on the floor earlier. And I'm going to leave it there. Like I said, there's a lot of very serious stuff in part two. It's a little bit of a somber video, but I wanted to just make sure that it at least had its own kind of segment in the summary series. So let me know what you think. Let me know if you have any questions as well, especially if you haven't seen the documentary, but do make sure that you go and watch it. And thank you so much for watching. Have a beautiful day further. Apologies for the noise. I managed to find a time when there were no dogs and then there were birds. Have a great day.